Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's talk at the Library at Asia Society Switzerland. Since this is the first time I'm speaking to an Asia Society Switzerland audience since February 24, let me just first say on behalf of the entire team and organization that we are absolutely horrified by the war currently unfolding in Ukraine. The conflict and its global repercussions will feature, of course, in today's discussion, as well as in many other elements of our program going forward. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge the immense pain and suffering this is causing in the Ukrainian population. So today's conversation, which of course we planned before the Russian invasion into Ukraine, but which is no less relevant because of it, will focus on the Arctic and its importance for geopolitical competition, especially between Russia and China. I'm very thrilled to welcome Benno Zogg today to discuss this with us. Benno is a senior researcher and the team head of the Swiss and Euro-Atlantic Security Team at the Center for Security Studies at the ETH. He's the co-editor of the monthly series CSS Analysis and Security Policy, as well as other publication. He's also the co-head of the Peace and Security Program at the Foreign Policy think tank Voraus, member of the steering committee of the OSCE network of think tanks, and security correspondent at Radio Monocle 24. He holds a BA in Political Science and Modern History from the University of Zurich, and an MA in Conflict, Security and Development from King's College in London. He's worked at the Swiss Consulate General in Hong Kong, relevant to Asia Society, of course, as well as a London-based NGO. His research focuses on Swiss and European security policy and the nexus of security, trade, and development policy. He's also focused on the international politics of Eurasia, Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia, including the influence of China and the Belt and Road Initiative. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, he's had a somewhat busy few weeks, as he has been on literally every news channel in Switzerland and beyond, doing a marvelous job explaining what is going on in Ukraine to the Swiss public. So we're very grateful that you're joining us today, that you're taking time out of your busy schedule to talk about the Arctic, which is maybe not something that's on everyone's mind right now, but it should be. So you're all aware of the format here at the library. We're trying to keep this as interactive as we can. Ben and I will talk for 35 minutes, and we welcome your questions after that. If you're in the room, you can just raise your hand. I would ask you to wait for a microphone so that the people joining us online can hear your question as well. Of course, if you are joining us online, then you may use the Q&A function on Zoom at the bottom of your screen just to type your question, and I will read it from my phone when we get to questions. So when we talk about regions, I think it's always a good idea to start with looking at them. I think we all have a general sense of where the Arctic is. It's somewhere north, but it pays to maybe look at it a little bit more closely. So maybe to start us off, Benno, where is the Arctic and how is it governed and who actually lives there? And I know you've also brought some maps that we can look at, which will help us answer these questions.
Absolutely. I think those questions are very fundamental to any kind of region, but maybe even more crucial to the Arctic, because if you mention maps, the usual maps we see, Eurocentric, usually the equator is in the middle, doesn't even show the Arctic or much of it. So to put it very, very bluntly, the Arctic is probably an ocean surrounded by continents. And when we come to actual definitions, it gets a bit trickier. The most commonly used is that it encompasses the land and ocean within the Arctic Circle. We see that on the map just here. The Arctic Circle is the dotted circle just there. And this, by consequence, means that there's 8 Arctic states. The US through Alaska, Canada, Russia, Denmark through Greenland, one must emphasize, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. Iceland barely scratching at the Arctic Circle. There's another definition that would be who borders the Arctic Ocean, if you will. And if that is the definition, this would exclude Sweden, Finland, and Iceland, for example. So already definitions aren't too clear, but the one with the Arctic Circle is the most common. And since it is mostly ocean, the question of who actually lives there is really crucial. And if we take the Arctic Circle definition, there's around 3 million people living within that, and a vast majority of those in Russia. We see those, particularly the European parts of Russia. This is where majority of Arctic inhabitants live. But among those 3 million, very crucial to mention is that there's many indigenous groups, different ethnicities, several million, depending on how you count. And this becomes relevant as well when we talk about Arctic governance, because there's a wide spectrum of institutions, of fora, of even very informal platforms that partially govern the Arctic. And the most important is probably the Arctic Council, and we'll talk about it later, I'm sure, with these 8 Arctic states being the members, 6 indigenous groups being permanent participants, and 13 states being observers, plus some NGOs and entities, further observers. This is the most crucial forum for Arctic matters, where ministers meet regularly, where there's working groups where there's actually permanent structures, including a secretariat in Tromsø in Norway. So this is the format we talk about, but it's mostly an intergovernmental, plus these institutions platform, whereas actual binding legal agreements that govern the Arctic or govern other oceans or territories are mostly dealt with outside of the Arctic Council. So the Arctic Council is a facilitating platform, but it doesn't conclude binding agreements. The biggest legal agreement that governs what's happening in the Arctic is actually UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Seas, which applies to any kind of oceans. Of course, it governs what are exclusive economic zones and so on. And what I haven't mentioned, of course, when we talk about the Arctic being mostly an ocean with territory around it, is that it's an ocean covered in ice most of the time. As we see on this map that we have here, in dark green is the extent of the Arctic ice in September of, I think, 2020. And the green dotted line is the median extension of the ice in the past 40 years, I believe, also in September. So what we see, of course, the ice is melting. That's an obvious one. We're all aware of that. We're aware of climate change. Unfortunately, the Arctic feels the effects of climate change disproportionately. So the ice is melting at a faster rate than pretty much anywhere else. And this brings us maybe to my last point of this general introduction, of course. Why are we talking about the Arctic now? Because things are changing. And the ice melt is probably the biggest trigger of it. What this brings is hopes of new sea routes, of economic opportunities, of traffic, of military activity, of military deployments, and so on. So because all of that is changing so fast, the Arctic all of a sudden becomes more prominent, whereas it's been largely neglected in past decades, of course, and during the Cold War and so on. So that's probably why we should look at maps that have the Arctic at its center a bit more often.
Excellent, thank you very much. And we do have more maps with the Arctic at its center for later that we can come back to. My follow-up question here, before we sort of go also into the changes the Arctic is seeing and what they mean in a geopolitical context, is the Arctic Asian? or maybe a bit more precise, like to which extent could the Arctic be Asian?
It's a tricky one, of course, because what does it mean to be Asian for anything, whether that's people or regions or activities? Certainly, I think if we look at the landmass here on the right on this map, which is essentially what Eurasia is, it is this vast space that is mostly Russia, leading all the way to this appendix that is Europe, or in that case, Scandinavia. So geographically speaking, much of the Arctic, and particularly of its landmass and its economic opportunities, is Asian indeed. So for Russia, for example, whose majority of territory is in what we consider geographic Asia, again, these Arctic territories within Russia contain the majority of its hydrocarbons. So economically, for Russia, the Asian part of Russia, which is northern Siberia, is crucially important, even though its population centers, of course, are elsewhere. What we also don't really see, because it goes beyond this circle, is a number of Asian powers that are invested and interested in the Arctic. And China is the most obvious one, but there's also Japan, South Korea, even Singapore, through shipping, through energy, through trades, that is somewhat invested. Plus, if we, maybe just the last point on the Asian dimension, if we think of Russia, we tend to think of the majority that makes up Russia demographically, which are ethnic Slavs, but obviously, particularly in the Asian parts of Russia, there's a number of minorities, what we consider indigenous, but also others that make up Russia as well. So Russia, in our perspective, tends to be European or maybe Eurasian, but it has a big Asian part as well. And the very last point on that, it's kind of interesting. You ask whether the Arctic is partially Asian. Russia is partially Asian, but also emphasizes sometimes that it goes beyond that, that it isn't just part Europe, part Asia, that it's something else as well, Eurasian or whatever you want to call it. And the Arctic, this space up north, is kind of part of that as well. So it even informs, let's say, Russian identity to some extent, not just economics.
Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned this already before, of course, and again, I think to a certain extent, people know that, and it's obvious. The Arctic is changing as a direct result of climate change. The ice is melting, which has a series of effects. You know, if you look at sort of the ecosystems, many of these effects are devastating. But there are also sort of geopolitical, economic effects, which are the ones we wanted to focus on today, which of course is that the Arctic becomes more accessible. So what exactly does that mean? How is it becoming more accessible? And as a result, why is it becoming more interesting?
Just to give one number in that respect, we can talk about the ice melt, but the numbers actually are that in the past 40 years, I believe, 3/4 of the Arctic ice has disappeared. So these are the dimensions we're talking about. And that is kind of illustrating that change that is happening. And when you raise these questions of, when it becomes tangible, both trade and economic opportunities more generally, we are talking about these resources that are oil and gas mostly, of which they say about 20% of global oil reserves and about 30% of global gas reserves are in the Arctic, mostly in Russia, again. So when these coastlines become a bit more ice-free, and we have to emphasize a bit more ice-free, they're somewhat ice-free and navigable about 4 months per year in summer, in late summer, and most of the other time there is actual genuine ice for most of that part. But already that allows for some economic opportunities, and specifically at the northern coast of Russia, there's some of Russia's major gas exploration fields happening, some onshore, some offshore, including, of course, the capacity to transport these resources abroad through tankers, through pipelines, and so on. But there's minerals involved as well. There's uranium, there's nickel, there's even gold in some parts, and so on. So some of that is explorable, some of that isn't. When it comes to all of that, these opportunities, I may use another map because that's when this becomes relevant. We have an ocean in the middle that is mostly governed by international agreements, but where someone's coastline ends and thus economic exclusive zones start is disputed. So what we see here is not only that this red dot in the middle, the actual North Pole, is disputed, it's a vast area around it as well. And there's disputes between loads of actors on the very North Pole, between Canada, Denmark, and Russia, other parts of the ocean, between, let's say, Russia and Canada, between Denmark and Canada, and so on. And this obviously informs how or by whom any kind of exploration or, let's say, also navigation can happen and is controlled by. So far, what's encouraging is that all these claims that exist are mostly out in the ocean where exploration isn't really feasible just yet for loads of reasons. It's risky to explore in the Arctic. If there's an accident, which can happen anytime, there's no one to save you. If there's an oil spill, nobody can clean it up. So danger involved. And most of the economic activity thus and all these opportunities are happening within undisputed both waters and land. The only land dispute, and some may be aware of that, is actually between Denmark and Canada, surprisingly, not Russia involved, about some tiny island where these border guards keep changing and leave each other a bottle of whiskey for the other to pick up. So it's somewhat a dispute between friends. So these are kind of the basic that informs all of it. And Russia, in all its, to once again emphasize, I mention Russia a lot because it's the major actor. It has supremacy in this region. All other actors are small or even lagging in their activities and opportunities. Russia very much in all its strategies emphasizes the Arctic, most economic opportunities, but also navigation, is trying to build particularly natural gas projects. So this is particularly the activities that we should watch out for. And when Russia builds such infrastructure and tries to sell that kind of gas, main cooperation partner and customer is, of course, China. And again, the Asian dimension comes in.
And let's now focus also on on the Asia dimension and, of course, on China. One thing we didn't talk about in too much detail, and let's get to there now, is not the natural resources in the Arctic itself, but the Arctic itself as a shipping route. Now, obviously, when there's ice, you can ship things there. When there's no ice, it becomes a little bit easier. And there has been a lot of talk about what's referred to as the Northern Sea Route, NSR, becoming more feasible. And if you just look at the numbers, if you want to ship something from China to, say, Europe, if you do it the normal way, you go through the Malacca Strait, you go to the Suez Canal. There may be problems in the Suez Canal. You may not get through because there's a ship there blocking your way. But there's also geopolitical considerations. Of course, the Malacca Strait is a relatively easily a choke point you can cut off. And it's much longer. So the Arctic route, the northern route, I think is a third shorter, just in terms of miles. So there's a lot of arguments in favor of the NSR, but it's also been debated. It's not actually yet working. There's some shipping there, if I understand correctly, but not much, neglectable by any standard. So how realistic is it for things to be actually shipped through the Arctic, in the foreseeable future?
Yeah. Are
the electronics that are produced in China that we buy going to have traveled through the Arctic at any point soon?
Yeah, it's a crucial question because in all kinds of government strategies and ambitious documents, this shipping component is very much highlighted. That includes the Russian and Chinese papers, for example, on the region. So apparently there is the aspiration and the hope for it. And we see on the map a number of potential trade routes. And the one you mentioned that is most crucial is the blue one here. That is essentially the Northeast Passage, just north of Russia. And yeah, compared to the regular Malacca Straits and Suez Canal routes, let's say between Shanghai and Rotterdam, Europe's biggest port, it would cut, theoretically speaking, shipping time reduce it by 1/3 to 40%. Essentially, that is 2 to 3 weeks, which can be considerable, of course. So ambitions are certainly there. And as the ice melts, of course, this becomes more and more feasible. But the starting point that we have right now is these aspirations and ambitions do exist, but we see very little happening tangibly. So we see energy exploration in the Arctic and this energy being shipped through these massive LNG tankers, very specialized ships, specifically reinforced for Arctic conditions as well, to work in, like, say, icy conditions. This energy is being exported to both Europe and Asia, and that is customers are mostly Japan and China. But this is about it. There's very little of this Belt and Road aspiration that is transit between, let's say, East Asia more generally, or China specifically, and Europe or Western Europe. There's hardly a single cargo ship crossing these Arctic oceans between these centers of economy. So when we say, well, what's the actual time frame of what we're talking, maybe 20 years from now, there may be a few dozen ships crossing that. And maybe not because it's viable from a business perspective, but because it's politically encouraged, or because it works as redundancies to diversify trade routes. And that's where the whole idea, of course, of the Belt and Road Initiative comes in as well. China speaks of a polar Silk Road as one of these potential corridors. And this actually picks up an earlier Russian concept or idea or desire of an ice Silk Road or so. So originally it was Russia's push to actually explore these waters for navigation. But yeah, it isn't really much happening because of these harsh conditions, because the ice is still massive, mostly because there's nothing there that is markets. There's no cities there that can receive goods or send goods. It's really just energy exploration. It's risky to have an accident because, again, nobody can help you. It's risky because there's very few ports as well that could receive any kind of goods where you could refuel and so on. Russia is ambitious to build those, but they don't exist just yet, meaning it's not really economically viable anytime soon and thus desirable to do that. The Belt and Road has other corridors, and one of these corridors that can also diversify away from Malacca Straits is, of course, rail connections through Central Asia and through Russia as well. So it appears that in the future, at some point when the ice actually melts, which we obviously don't actually hope, there could be these corridors, but for the foreseeable decades or so, there is very little happening apart from energy and resource exploration itself.
So that kind of begs the question, why is China so interested in the Arctic? China obviously is not an Arctic state. I think we've established that. It's not visible on any of these maps we've seen so far.
Arctic state.
It is. China, which I think is just a brilliant idea of whoever came up with this in Chinese policy circles. China has dubbed itself a near Arctic state. Whatever do they mean by that?
It's somewhat elegant, I find. Obviously, if you look at geography, China isn't that far, geographically speaking, from the region. It has its ice and snow, and apart from the near Arctic, which implies just geographical proximity, they also come up with the concept of third pole, which is we have the two poles, that is the Arctic and Antarctica. The third pole will be the Himalayas, with glaciers, with ice mass, and so on. And interestingly, Switzerland has a similar concept. They also emphasize investment in the region, or let's say being affected by it, or being able to contribute to the Arctic, because we have altitude, we have glaciers, and so on. So some research can be transferred, but that's also quite a bit of a stretch and quite creative, if you will. Yeah.
So China is a near Arctic state. They also have a pole, apparently. I read a quote from, I think it was a Chinese general who also, I think, very smart. They said, well, the Arctic, are governed by UNCLOS, so they're international waters. They're owned by all of humankind. We, of course, happen to have a fifth of humankind, so a fifth of the Arctic kind of should belong to us, which I also thought was a clever argument. Beyond the sort of these sort of intellectual constructs, it seems obvious to me, China needs energy in the Arctic, and Russia especially are a source of energy. Yep. So there's an argument there. Are there other factors that sort of play into China's interest in the Arctic? Why is the Arctic a strategic priority for China?
It's obviously not the only strategic priority, but it's one that is heavily emphasized, one must really say, in strategic documents in China, in think tank discussions and so on. Energy being one of them, an obvious one, a tangible one. Another being this shipping route that we mentioned, and there Russia is a strategic partner, of course. And the other ones are much harder to grasp, and there's a lot of rumors around them. And to mention maybe the first one, which many are concerned about, is military. Back in the Cold War, the Arctic had a strategic importance, particularly for nuclear second strike capabilities, essentially meaning that submarines carrying nuclear missiles can hide under the ice shields in case capitals or the actual country, be it the Soviet Union or the US, were attacked, that these submarines would ensure second strike capability. Any kind of missile defense between, let's say, Russia and the US would also happen in the Arctic. And all these dimensions obviously may apply to China as well, which has nuclear weapons capabilities, it has submarines. And then these Arctic conditions come in as well, which are harsh, which are difficult to navigate. So it can be a testing ground for certain equipment when it comes to submarines, when it comes to small manned or unmanned submarines, when it generally comes to shipping needing to work under any kind of conditions, being submarines, being military Navy ships, Coastal Guard ships, and so on, that the Arctic is a space where these can be used, where these can be tested, because the idea is very much of the Arctic being this neglected space, this frontier space, the being unexplored, and thus being a place where one can conduct such activities. And one thing that is very strategic as well, and certainly tangible Chinese interest, it is satellites as well. There's a satellite station in Sweden, but also in other places that feeds into the Baidu, my pronunciation is not correct, Chinese satellite system, which can be used militarily as well, of course, for cyber capabilities and so on. So to ensure this kind of satellite coverage, the Arctic is important. And lastly, there isn't just regular belts and roads and the Arctic Silk Road. There's also what they call this digital Silk Road, which has a potential component in the Arctic, which will be underseas cables, which would also cut communication lines between, let's say, China and Western Europe considerably. So there's all these dimensions to it. There's allegations that even economic activities by China can be used for other purposes, military, for example, because there's rumors about certain ports in Greenland, in Sweden, and so on that have Chinese ownership about certain lands. There's this ominous golf court in Iceland that was supposed to be purchased by Chinese business, and everyone was wondering, why on earth would you build a golf court in Iceland? That can't just be tourism, that can be strategy. Essentially, this can be used at some point as a Chinese military base or naval base and so on. So there's a lot of these elements out there, and the accusation are really that China is more present and has these kind of aspirations as well.
Let's dig in a little bit also on how China sort of tries to act on these aspirations. Before we do, I just want to remind the people who are joining us online that if you have questions, you feel free to submit them at any time through the Q&A function. You can post them in the chat. The result of that will just be that I don't see them. So if you would like me to see your questions, please use the Q&A function. So we've established China's interests, and as you've mentioned, they're manifold, and you've already sort of alluded to some creative ways of how those aspirations may be put into place, like building golf courts in Iceland. More generally, though, how does China's engagement in the Arctic look? It can't just go there and build stuff on its own. Again, it's not a member of the Arctic. It doesn't have an economic zone in the Arctic. How does it actually engage? With whom? Through which means? In which size? In which volume?
It's actually quite interesting because obviously the major strategic partner in that is Russia, which has the biggest Arctic coastline, is actually strategically aligned with China. And all these trade routes in particular and the energy sources are on either Russian land or in Russian waters. So that is crucial, but it isn't just Russia, as we may perceive. There's actually quite some investment in other Arctic countries as well. Chinese investments flowing into rare earth mines in Greenland, for example, in ports in Sweden, in golf courses in Iceland, but there's also free trade agreements with Iceland, for example, concluded with China. So it is quite tangible in all kinds of ways. And research collaboration is an element of that. Based on a very old treaty about Svalbard, is the Treaty of Spitsbergen of 1925, of which China is a signatory. There's been loads of research cooperation and an actual research base, a center, an actual presence that is Chinese on Svalbard. And again, then all these dual use concerns come in, whether certain research results don't just inform climate change in China or aren't just for economic purposes, but potentially also for geostrategic or even military. So we see these trade ties that are being built, surprisingly free trade agreement with Iceland, that must indicate almost a bit of a strategic component to it, not just commercial. And research being kind of an opening doors, if you will. It allows for contact, it allows for presence, but it doesn't have this suspicion that immediately comes with, let's say, naval presence to it. So there's loads of activities that one may add as well, just people-to-people contacts. There's NGOs that receive research grants from China. There are joint research teams. There are naval exploration as well with Chinese icebreakers for scientific purposes. So the spectrum of activities is actually really broad.
We've kind of touched upon, maybe danced around even a little bit, sort of the Russia-China relationship in this context, because I really wanted to first also kind of, wanted for us to establish sort of the Arctic as an area, but of course, that is, for the purpose of our conversation today, the most important bilateral relationship in the Arctic, and it's one that's been in the news for entirely other reasons over the last few weeks. There's been all this conversation on how China is positioning itself vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine and what that means for its relationship with Russia. Before we sort of get into the possible effects on the Arctic and on Chinese strategy there by the war, let's just look at the China-Russia relationship in the Arctic, because there have been several people who know that while it currently makes sense for the two countries to collaborate, and it certainly makes sense for Russia to receive Chinese investment in its ports in the Arctic, that the long-term interests of both countries in the Arctic may not necessarily be aligned. Could you elaborate on that? But where are sort of the friction lines, or the possible friction lines between the two countries in the Arctic?
The partnership is really crucial, as you say. I would fully agree. The idea, of course, of the starting point is that Russia is dominant and China as a supporting partner, if you will, just because it isn't an Arctic state as such. So in Russia's mindset, it is Russia is implementing and overseeing any kind of activities and projects that are happening with Chinese capital. That's the ideal thing. But obviously, while Russia sees this opportunity in a partnership with China, generally the Arctic is also a new source of vulnerability, as in it is its northern frontier, its northern border. Any kind of activity that it cannot control there can be a threat. And at some point down the line, this may entail Chinese activities as well. So the framework for Moscow must very much be that China remains a junior partner in all of that, a supporting partner, not in any way infringing on Russia's dominance. I think that fundamentally is a bit of a problem. And even a legal, not a dispute, but a bit of a difference comes in, because while most of these sea routes are within Russia's territorial waters, and that's undisputed, when it becomes an international sea route, there's freedom of navigation. So, and Russia and Canada, by the way, have an interest to keep those waters as not defined as international sea routes, but so to maintain these prerogatives as the sovereign. Whereas China, of course, is more interested in freedom of navigation. And we see an interesting contrast, of course, to the South China Sea, where things are perceived a bit different. So sometimes this link is being made as well. So there's a source of legal tension at some point. And obviously, Russia needs to maintain its strong position to actually explore it without China dictating terms at some point. And the war in Ukraine comes in, sanctions come in, which make Russia even more reliant in the long term, foreseeable, on Chinese capital, on Chinese technology as well, on support from China. And this alters this kind of balance that we've seen so far as well. It may accelerate China gaining leverage over Russia, which certainly in some places in Moscow is already seen with hesitation and a bit of worry.
And it seems to me that's really interesting, because so we generally perceive Russia as being the junior partner in the Russia-China relationship. But you said, and I think that's a very good point, in the Arctic, so it would be the other way around. So with this increased dependence on Beijing and Moscow as a result of the war in Ukraine, could probably either result in greater Russian reluctance to give China leeway in the Arctic so as to not even create more imbalance in the relationship. But it could also mean that Russia just has less leverage and might have to sort of let China in, so to speak, into the Arctic. So this could really go either way, I guess.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. And the long run is, of course, that given current trajectories, that China's footprint in the region will inevitably grow, not just in Russia, but also among others. And that Russia is in relative decline, and sanctions and all of that accelerate that. What we don't really know just yet is how sanctions and secondary sanctions will also affect this Russian-Chinese collaboration, because intuitively one could assume, okay, the only remaining partner for Russia is now China, which can essentially snatch up any kind of resource contracts or infrastructure that Russia may offer, because there's no more Western bidders. But many Chinese companies, and particularly private banks, are partially complying with sanctions as well, just because the business risk of dealing with Russia is heightened. Can Russia, for the mere financial transaction reasons, still be able to, let's say, pay for certain loans? Is Russia bankrupt soon? And what does it mean if Russia is bankrupt? Will Russian private or state-owned companies that are part of this energy exploration, will they still be viable? Do they still have access to the technology that is needed for all of that? So there's a number of risks coming in. So risks and opportunities for Chinese actors, for Russia as well. Trajectory is probably that Russia will decline anyway, and China will gain a bit more of the upper hand, but the whole importance of this context and this partnership may also decline. But that depends on the trajectory. The war is still quite young and can still go in different ways, but it's certainly not just a pure opportunity or a pure risk now from a Chinese perspective. That maybe adds to their restraint or their bit of mixed signals that they send on this context.
Before we open for questions, we focus strongly on the Russia-China relationship, which I do think really is the most important one here. But there are other countries involved. Obviously, the US is a member of the Arctic Council. Canada is a member of the Arctic Council. Several European countries are members. Is there is there any meaningful Arctic collaboration between China and any of these countries? Would we see maybe a Chinese shift away from Russia as Russia maybe becomes more isolated, and I don't know, a US-China sort of deepened Arctic collaboration in an effort to open that up, or is that not in the cards?
Hard to see, because I think the dominating setting for the next decades in international politics is US-China competition. So room for collaboration is quite slim. And now that Russia is not a collaborating partner anymore, generally, but also in the Arctic, this becomes even more difficult. So it's hard to see that. China is engaging other countries as well. It's very invested in even Canadian energy exploration and so on. So this is already happening, but I don't see major shifts just happening there. Sorry, just the last point, of course, from Russian as well as from other perspectives, it isn't just China, of course. Russia is also trying to diversify its sources. So there's hopes that Indian companies have increased stakes in energy exploration. There have been negotiations going on, and India, of course, not part of that Western sanctioning coalitions, may have more room as well. When it comes to South Korea and Japan, which are politically more aligned with the US, it's a bit more difficult. But there's many actors at play, both in energy, in shipping, and so on. So we shouldn't just boil it down, of course, to China, Russia.
Thank you. And we should mention, I think we haven't really touched on that as a very direct result of the war in Ukraine, the Arctic Council, which you mentioned is the main governing body, has effectively suspended work because the other 7 members that are not Russia have decided to not attend any meetings of the council anymore in Russia. And since Russia is currently chairing the council, all these meetings would have taken place. So there's also a little bit of a sort of a governance vacuum. Yeah. Which, if it's prolonged for many months or even years, may become an issue. Let's also just very briefly, again, before we open for questions, there's one major geopolitical power that plays a role in the Arctic that we haven't really gotten into, which is, of course, the mighty country of Switzerland. We are, I think, not yet a near Arctic country, though maybe we'll become one soon. But we are an observer state to the Arctic Council since 2008, maybe, or
later, 17, 18 or something.
Okay. Why are we there?
Very good question. Joined as an observer alongside many other countries. Switzerland very strongly made the case of its research, and particularly the one in our north, which is the altitudes, the glaciers, and so on. Research that we can contribute and research collaboration that Switzerland is already engaged in. That's the main point the Swiss Foreign Ministry emphasizes anywhere. So yeah, this altitude equals latitude logic of our glaciers and our permafrost can help inform research in the Arctic as well. I think there's also an element that isn't emphasized explicitly, that Switzerland may be not quite a mediator, but just a positive diplomatic power in that context as well, being able to contribute to, let's say, were there ever actual tensions or actual disputes that need settlement, to mediate, to facilitate some kind of talks, and generally to be at the table, of course. There's another element that is also not emphasized that strongly, which is, of course, commercial interests when it comes to resource trade, when it comes to very tangibly oil exploration and so on. There's a number of Swiss companies, commodity traders, but also banks, of course, insurance companies and so on, that have stakes in that context. And probably that was part of the motivation. But yeah, for a few years, Switzerland has been an observer. It's been quite active as well in working groups in the Arctic Council and trying to bring in this mostly scientific expertise, but somewhat surprising. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's open it up for questions. So if you have a question here in the room, please wait for the microphone and we'll get one to you. Again, for online participants, please submit your questions through the Q&A to the Q&A function, and we'll get to these as well. I think, Phil, you got a question?
Yeah, 3 points. 2 of them are very quick. The other is the issue of the coastal waters. And I'm not quite sure that I understand where anybody has claimed coastal waters and whether or not that's part of the treaties that have gone on. The other two are, as I say, are very quick. One, you haven't commented on fishing in the Arctic waters. And lastly, you mentioned the Swiss mountains and altitude. What is the highest point in the Arctic?
That's where altitude versus latitude comes in, of course. If they have glaciers at ground level, we have them up there. I think those are important questions, maybe to these territorial claims that we see here on the map. They're being claimed in international courts, if you will, and they are continuously fed these claims with further exploration. Essentially, one of the questions, for example, and if we look at the center here, this blue bit, the Lomonosov Ridge, which Russia claims is an extension underwater of its continental shelf. Thus, they base their claim on that. And to be honest, other states have similar kind of claims. So these claims exist. They're constantly fed. There isn't a ruling just yet, but it's still ongoing. There's commissions. I don't know what the legal entity exactly is, but there's commissions studying these claims. And one must say this is somewhat reassuring because so far all actors, by consequence, have agreed to these kind of formal procedures. But once there is a ruling, of course, similar to the South China Sea, one must see whether it's abided by. And you mentioned the point of fishing, which is a bit of a theoretical exercise because, at least in the Arctic Ocean, there isn't much fishing that is viable in international waters, only in territorial waters. But there's an almost preemptive agreement that was concluded a few years ago between all these states, and including China and loads of other signatories, not to conduct fishing in these waters at all. Again, it's not practically viable just yet, but this is kind of the aspiration because again, fishery there it's dangerous, it's hazardous. The weather conditions are really extreme. So even were it somewhat feasible at some point, it could be very, very dangerous. And then these competing claims, of course, become all the more important. But this is one of these encouraging signs that the Arctic has facilitated or has seen a lot of cooperation and agreements and abiding by legal principles, including such a no fishery agreement.
Is that enforceable, with no fishing?
I mean, it's as enforceable as any international agreement, if you will. It can be breached, but there's certain actors that have interest. So if there were breaches, it would probably be made public and there could be collisions, the likes we see again in the South China Sea, for example. But enforceable by any international body, of course, no, because there is no such international army that will enforce it.
I'm just going to throw in a follow-up question from the online audience because that seems relevant to what you just said. And the question is to whether you could please talk in a bit more detail about the Lomonosov Ridge, so what it is and why it matters. And we can just look at the map again to see where it is.
Yeah, I don't know too many details about it, but it's certainly the most cited claim and the most, because it entails the North Pole as such, and it overlaps. 3 countries have overlapping claims in that region.
Is that where Russia planted the flag and
exactly.
underwater in 2008? Yeah,
exactly. That was the first very evident claim. It was a titanium flag, a Russian flag that was planted by some submarine on part of this Lomonosov Ridge to make it very, very clear whose claim is happening. And as we see, it just extends quite far into the Arctic Ocean. So this is probably the most contested claim out there. Others are a bit more minor, and I don't know the numbers, but there's also alleged resource deposits, particularly gas, that would be part of that region.
Excellent. And then I think we had another question from the room. Here we go.
Thanks. 2 factual questions. One, if you could maybe explain where those funny shapes of those claims come from. I mean, it's not really comprehensible. And on the first map, the routes, the sea routes, you mentioned also that there were territorial waters. So I'm guessing you're talking about the northeast route, which is, does it cross the 12-mile zone, or what's that?
So yeah, the funny shapes, there's a number of logics there. Part is the continental shelf logic. The other one is, and that explains the straight lines that we see here, for example. is just an extension of coastal waters. Exactly, that creates these very, very mixed patterns. I'm not an expert on all these claims in particular, because usually the way I've been informed about them is that there's a number of, let's say, reasons that are indicated for why certain waters should be ones specific. And just to add to that, of course, it's interesting to see that Greenland is the extension of Denmark in all of that, where Greenland, to change political course, independence, of course, everything could be again.
Or being bought by the US.
Or being bought by the US, being bought by China. There's allegations for either. Trump may be back, so
is there a golf course yet?
And yeah, that one. On the routes that you mentioned, I mean, this is a creative drawing of where these routes are, and there's conflicting indication of which one is the most interesting. Some say that the central one, actually going straight through I don't know what it's officially called. I think they call it the Arctic Bridge. Yeah, is most promising, but most others emphasize that the one following quite closely the coastline, this is the one where search and rescue can happen. This is the one where the supporting ports, where actually energy exploration is happening, is the most substantial. So that would be within territorial waters, but probably mostly, let's say, within exclusive economic zones, more so than just territorial waters. Yeah, which is 200 nautical miles. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm going to ask a question from the online audience, which actually is very interesting. I was not aware of this. So the question is that apparently the third pole, which you mentioned, this idea that the Himalayas are the third pole, is something that's not just used by the Chinese government, but also very often by Tibetan activists to highlight the ecological disaster unfolding under Chinese development. And the question, which I think is a really interesting question, is, why would China choose to use a concept that is also being used as, denote alleged negative consequences of its leadership? I don't know if you have an answer to this, but I thought it was a really interesting point.
Interesting. I can only partially speculate that maybe Beijing isn't even aware of that narrative being used, or is so confident in being able to dominate the narrative so they can reclaim the third pole. And it's somewhat of an elegant concept, maybe. But that is very interesting. And much of these Chinese claims and activities are actually justified with climate change, with sustainable development, and so on. There's even the claim, which I think has some factual base, that conditions in the Arctic influence even the weather on Chinese lands. Yeah. So this kind of sustainable development comes in, which is all the more ironic, of course, if Tibet comes in.
Just checking if there are immediate questions from the room. If not, we can continue with online questions. There's another question which was interesting. We've only talked about two of the three poles, right? The Himalayas and the Arctic. We haven't talked about Antarctica. In this conversation, there's a question from somebody online, if there are any learnings and sharings between the way that Antarctica is managed, which is through something called the Antarctic Treaty, and the way the Arctic is managed. So, those regions are not directly comparable. One is the continent, the other one is an ocean, but still are there similarities, or are there difference in the way they're being managed?
Obviously, from a historical perspective, they've always been approached differently, because the Arctic is where there's actual settlements, where there's economic activities, where there's territorial claims, and so on. So the Arctic was always approached with this club mentality of a limited number of countries that have stakes and deal with governance themselves. There's certainly some similarities that we see. For example, the Svalbard Treaty on this free research and demilitarized Svalbard, which is territorially Norwegian, but can have resource centers and stations, research stations by any number of countries. So we see similarities with Antarctica there, which has this demilitarized and free research aspect to it as well. We may see similarities in the future, because there are very much territorial claims in Antarctica as well, by Britain, by Norway, by Argentina, and the likes. But this is not really happening, because Antarctica is still economic, and other opportunities are very limited. And we discussed earlier, there's certainly no trade routes passing by there anytime soon. So very, very limited. I'm not an expert on Antarctic governance, and I'm aware of a bit of a debate among experts whether any kind of lessons can be drawn from one to the other, because the actors are fairly different, the existing governance fora are fairly different, and the actual tangible interests are fairly different as well.
Let me actually follow up with another online question, because it concerns Svalbard, which you've mentioned. Maybe we can go back to the map where, well, it's on this one as well, but I think it's a little bit, yes, exactly. Here we see it better. So the question is, as you've mentioned, Svalbard is governed by Norway. So it's a territorial in Norway, which is part of NATO. But there are, the question says, 2 settlements that are de facto governed by Russia. I assume that those may be sort of research stations or settlements. And the question is, would the current situation in Ukraine sort of impact that relationship? So it's an interesting point that in the Arctic, there's sort of, there are Russia-governed settlements on the territory of a NATO member. Tricky.
It's a very particular setting. I'm not aware of too many other examples where this is as internationalized, because there's also a Chinese research station, for example, that is also essentially the territory of China in a governance sense. And this emphasizes very much that NATO and Russia are opposing each other in the Arctic. We have a number of NATO members, and prospectively maybe even Finland and Sweden, not just aligning themselves further with NATO, but even joining. So that makes it all the more tangible. And given we have this suspension of meetings within the Arctic Council, but also of meetings in other intergovernmental fora in the region, on the Barents Sea, on the Baltic Sea, and so on, it is quite worried to imagine that Russia is more and more isolated in Arctic fora as well, and thus may react in certain ways or derail some kind of cooperative agreement that Svalbard is. I don't think there's any kind of actual warfare that could happen there, or military bases or so, because that would violate the Treaty of Spitsbergen as well. But not just that, all these collaborative efforts on search and rescue, on research, on environmental issues as well are at risk of being derailed. Obviously also actual military confrontation in the region, less so in Svalbard itself, is very tangible. And military exercises are already happening yet again. I think cold response is currently ongoing in the Arctic. I think it's led by Norway or NATO. And similarly, Russia holds such exercises. I think beyond Svalbard, this risk is very tangible, and any kind of military activities and presence, which is increasing tangibly with bases, with patrols and so on, bears escalation risks, wanted or unwanted. So to answer that question a bit more broadly, I think there's a very tangible risk there. And with more and more negotiation formats being shut down, with Russia feeling more isolated, being more isolated, this just becomes all the more worrying.
Yeah. We have time maybe for one last question, a short one.
If I'm not mistaken, there was a research...
Hang on 1 second. I'm sorry for the microphone.
If I'm not mistaken, there was a research project, I think a year, 18 months ago, with a ship that went up to the Arctic and purposely froze into the ice and floated a great distance. Is there any relevance to the participants of that project and what's we've talked about today?
I'll be frank, I don't know the details of that. I've seen, I think, a picture or the headline along those lines, but I wouldn't know what the exact participants were or how it ended. I'm afraid I can't answer.
I think it was primarily sponsored by the U.S.
Okay.
I don't know what the circumstances of management of.
Let's maybe, this is a broad question for the time we have left, but it was submitted online, and I do want to bring that point in, so I'll just briefly ask it, and it's about the U.S. role in the Arctic. We haven't really touched upon that. The question sort of suggests that China is kind of, like more aware and sort of has invested more into becoming an Arctic power than the U.S. The U.S., is not really focused on Alaska, which is sort of where it sort of touches the Arctic. So can you give us any insights into sort of the US strategic view on the Arctic, also vis-a-vis the China interest?
Yeah, I think that's safe to say, depending on how we measure, of course, whether that's high governmental meetings, whether it's military presence, whether it's the number of icebreakers or so, in all of that measures, the US is somewhat lagging behind. It has formulated in recent strategic documents more ambitions for the Arctic. It does highlight it more whereas it hasn't been in the past, and particularly under Trump's presidency, with Mike Pompeo being very, very vocal as well at Arctic meetings, basically pointing out Russia and China as being aggressors in that region as well. This came with very tangible ambitions. So in terms of military presence, patrols, and also the building of icebreakers, but that's still prospective because it takes a while and quite some costs to do that. The US is catching up, if you will, but yeah, with a bit of a lag. So NATO partners for once, and Norway being a very crucial one in terms of intelligence as well as military capabilities, are almost ahead, because to them, the Arctic has always been national security, both in an economic sense and in a military sense, whereas to the US, it's been a bit of a neglected space. The US's attention was for a long time elsewhere, in the Middle East, on its own continent, let's say, the Americas, and now the focus on China. So I think the perception still is not just that the Arctic is more important to the US in and of itself, but also because it's more important to its major adversaries, which is Russia and China, essentially. So in that sense, the Arctic is also an arena for that kind of competition to play out in trade, in economic, but also in military manners. Less so for Arctic matters itself or for the Arctic's sake, but as kind of a secondary arena of these competitions playing out.
Excellent. I think this is a wonderful point to end this conversation. Thank you very much. There's so much I learned, and I think sort of one of my key takeaways really is that it's always good to look at maps. It's just always very important to look. We have to look more at maps.
And different kinds of maps.
And different kinds of maps. So thank you very much, Benno Zogg, for having been with us here today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today, either in person or online. I do want to just point briefly to the next talk at the library, which we haven't actually published yet, but you're here, so I'll tell you. It's going to be on June 15. And we'll be joined by Karin Wenger, who is currently the Southeast Asia correspondent for Swiss Public Radio. So she's written a number of books over the last years, all of which she will try to summarize within an hour here. So you can come and join us for that. The next event that we have is next week. It's an online-only event, the second to last episode of our series, A Closer Look, which focuses on Singapore. Of course, we talk a lot about Singapore as an economic hub, as a financial hub, but I think we don't spend enough time maybe talking about Singapore as a country and sort of looking at the cultural, political makeup of it. So that's your chance to sort of learn more about Singapore, the actual place. That's taking place on Thursday next week over lunch as well. So with that, again, Benno Zogg, thank you very much for having been here. Thank you to the audience. Excellent questions as always. And I look forward to seeing you soon.